On Tuesday, September 12th, I had the pleasure to sit down for an interview with Clare Daly. This was a day before the Israeli terrorist attacks with the pages in Lebanon, and that is why we don't mention the incident. Clare Daly is an Irish politician who was member of the European Parliament from Ireland from July 2019 to July 2024. She's a member of the Independents for Change and part of the left in the European Parliament. She was very active in politics from her teenage years and part of the Students' Union, and was a member of the Labour Party and a founding member of the Socialist Party. Since 2012, she has had a close political association with Mick Wallace. 2012 is also the year that she formed the United Left.
Thanks so much, Melanie, for inviting me on and giving us the opportunity for a chat. Very important in these dark days.
Yes, thank you for doing this, because I know you're very, very busy. You're trotting around the globe, from what I gather, doing lectures and talking and speeches, which is very important because you're continuing your advocacy for everything that is affecting the world, really.
Well,
today.
I suppose I've being in the European Parliament gave me the opportunity to visit probably almost every continent on the globe. And we've been to Africa, South America, Asia repeatedly, all across Europe. And ordinary people in every country think the same. They're all disconnected from the way in which society has been organized. They all want to live their lives in harmony and peace, and they feel very dissatisfied with the way in which the world is going. And the echo for our ideas and a different point of view, which actually isn't a different point of view, it's the old point of view. It's really just about standing up for the principles of international law, the type of world order that we need to have of international cooperation and the resolution of conflict and disputes through diplomacy and peaceful means rather than war. But what we see is the capture of the institutions of power in the West in particular by the military-industrial complex, who are distorting reality at a time when we should be cooperating to face the biggest challenge facing us all, that of climate change. So I think there's an enormous echo for those ideas everywhere, but everywhere they're being silenced in the mainstream. So it's so important that we do get to chat like this.
Well, I was talking with a friend the other day, and we were saying exactly this, that mainstream media and the mainstream narrative would have you believe that we are the radical ones or you are the radical one, when it's not radical. You're just asking for what is right and for what is morally correct. And it's so distorted, the way they present that it is okay to massacre children in the name of, it's not self-defense, it's colonialism. But let's start with the fact that you were not re-elected as member of the European Parliament and you lost your seat. Do you believe that your stance about Palestine, but also the way you, I'm not going to use the word attacked because it wasn't, the way you confronted Ursula von der Leyen and her cronies in the European Parliament, do you think that played a role?
Oh, absolutely not. Quite the opposite. That platform was incredibly popular in Ireland. Actually, Ireland is one of the most pro-European countries in all repeated surveys. But what changed that and what has personified the beginning of an opposition to that has been really the figure of Ursula von der Leyen, who I christened Frau Genocide, a name which has been taken up internationally, and people in Ireland literally cannot stand her. They see her for exactly what she is, a genocide enabler. She greenlighted Israel's attacks, stood and used the name of European citizens when she had no right at all in law or in the treaties to do that, but yet the leaders of Europe allowed her away with that. So that was incredibly popular in Ireland, actually. Most people in Ireland agree with that. I suppose one of the reasons why we didn't get re-elected, well, first of all, I'm an independent. It's always difficult as an independent. I think it's always difficult as well, particularly in Ireland, because there's no real coverage of what goes on in Europe. So people didn't really get to see what we were doing. and the mainstream media from the middle of our mandate, particularly around Russia's invasion of Ukraine, distorted our position for peace. I don't know what it was like in Cyprus, but pretty much everywhere else, if you argue for peace in Ukraine, you're a Russian apologist. It didn't matter.
I remember you were called that, and actually you were called a lot worse. You were called a collaborator of the Russians, a Russian proxy. You were called all sorts of things, but you stood your stance and said that exactly that.
Well, that was more of a factor because people in Ireland understand Palestine. I mean, we were and are occupied. A part of our island is still occupied by Britain. We had an affinity, and Irish nationalism always was very internationalist. We have an affiliation with the global south, being a country which is occupied, but yet in the heart of the Western world, with big connections with the US and that, for example. But that affinity with Palestine runs deep. Our understanding of Russia, though, is completely different. We're on the other periphery of Europe. We don't know much about it. We know a lot about the US from television, from language, from Irish people who emigrated, but we don't know much about Russia. And it's easy, and the military-industrial complex needs a bad guy. And it's easy to demonize the Russians. And of course, we condemned Russia's invasion. It was illegal under international law, and every vote we did that. But we also pointed out NATO's role in that it was a NATO proxy war, that the war may have been unjustified, but it was very much provoked. But we were demonized over that, the way in which the media took hold of that narrative and reinvented people who'd been anti-war activists all their lives as Russian apologists, while those who support every single war from Iraq to Afghanistan to Yemen to everything, and now are genocide enablers in terms of it supporting Israel against the people of Gaza, they somehow are up for the people of Ukraine. They're just worried about them and they want peace. It's total nonsense. But that narrative was hijacked. And that certainly was used to sort of demonize. But the real reason why we didn't get elected was because in true left-wing sectarianism, the left in Ireland, or the part of the left, decided that against that attack by the establishment, that I was maybe weakened and they could take my seat. We warned them that that wouldn't happen, that what they would do would be split the vote and lose the seat to the left. And we were sadly proven right. We nearly made it, but they split the vote and the seat was lost to the left. But look, what can you do?
Well, this is something that I noticed. I mean, Cyprus, the left, lost a seat as well. So instead of 2 MEPs, now Cyprus has 1 member of the European Parliament. And that is in correlation to the rise of the far right and the extreme far right. We desperately need voices of the left within the European Union and globally. So I guess it's just uphill from now on.
Well, I think one of the reasons maybe why, and a contributing factor to the rise of the far right, is that the left, and in particular, I think around the war in Ukraine, I mean, the idea of left-wing people supporting sending arms to prolong a conflict and somehow addressing that up as helping people in Ukraine, when all they've done is stand in the way of a diplomatic resolution. I mean, myself and my colleague Mick Wallace put repeated motions to the Parliament arguing for the European Union to use all its efforts for diplomacy and a peaceful resolution, which is actually the opinion of the majority of European citizens, but time after time that was voted down. And I think it's into that vacuum that we see the rise of the far right. I mean, people in Germany have seen the economy pauperized through the sanctions, which were self-defeating on Europe. We've huge economic problems now, manufacturing leaving Germany in search of cheaper energy costs because of us sanctioning ourselves. And into that vacuum, the far right have gained because they've said this is lunacy. But the left should have been doing that. I mean, there's attempts now with the, split in the left in Germany for a section of it to do that, but it's partly a contributing factor. And you're so right, the left needs to be stronger, but it buckled under this sustained and coordinated attack by the establishment across America and across Europe and all of the so-called global north to silence people who argued for peace and anti-militarization. And it reflects the capture of the European institutions by the military-industrial complex now very much like what we see in the US. I mean, more and more power is being subsumed into the center of Brussels, that Brussels bubble, where they have the ears of the lobbyists and the citizens are so far removed. So obviously the citizens are alienated and annoyed and frustrated, and rightly so. And unfortunately, the left, rather than confronting that, have sort of gone along with a lot of that official narrative out of fear of attack by the establishment. So, yeah.
That brings me to my next question. So you are critical of the European Parliament and the way it works, and especially the fact that people are appointed there, just like Ursula von der Leyen. And it was today, actually, a couple of hours ago, she announced her commissioners in the European Commission. And you just have to go down the list. So if we are critical, you are critical of the European Union and the European Parliament, why choose to be a member of the European Parliament? Can change come from within?
Yeah, good question. And I mean, actually, I had been a member of the Irish Parliament previously, quite well known for challenging the status quo in Ireland, along with my colleague Mick Wallace. And both of us, as members of the Irish Parliament, noticed that more and more legislation was coming from Europe. And we said, wonder, should we go and see, can you actually change it? And let's go and see, will we stand for Europe? So we stood in 2019, never with a view really of staying there long term or anything like that, but just trying to see for ourselves. And we were very skeptical, and maybe in the early days, we were probably thinking, yeah, can't change it, can't do anything here, we'll have to burn the place down. But actually what changed it was the very thing that began to demonize us at home. It was the war in Ukraine, because then we felt we were really in the right place at the right time, because the position that we were arguing, which wasn't getting an outlet anywhere in Europe, was hugely received by citizens all over Europe. So even as we were being demonized in the Irish press as an embarrassment and a disgrace to Ireland, and we really were the living end, we had to be got rid of, even during that, there were large amounts of people in Ireland saying, thank goodness that you're there, that somebody is arguing and the voice of reason and diplomacy and common sense. And across Europe, everywhere we met people. So really, we were able to use it as a platform to agitate from. And I suppose in all of my political life as an activist, I've always really viewed electoral politics as simply a platform to organize from, because it's a myth that politicians change things. They don't. Ordinary people change things, organizing from below, often having to drag the politicians behind them. So once you're elected and you have a platform, it's harder for them to ignore you. And with the advent of social media, we've managed to generate quite a large social media following of people who get an insight into what's going on there because of following us on social media. So it actually, and it hadn't been the plan originally, but we built such a platform, particularly around calling out the EU's enablement of the genocide in Gaza, that we had a responsibility to stand again, even though that hadn't been the original plan. So we gave it our all, but obviously we didn't get elected. But we knew that there were people everywhere who felt that that was so important. So I don't think you can legally change it. It's an inherently undemocratic institution. But what is worrying, and particularly because it's not been commented upon anywhere in the media, is this power grab to the center. So we have Brussels situated there, where there are tens of thousands of registered lobbyists who have the ear of the Commission and the Parliament, from big tech, big pharma, the military industrial complex. The citizens are really far removed, and the member states who are supposed to agree things through unanimity, even that now is being undermined. And the idea is, if you speak out and you try and defend your own national interests, no, that's not on. We have to defend the union. So I think there's huge problems. It's, you know, if you look at it in the recent elections in many countries, less than 30% of people voted. It's not democratic.
Yes.
Parliament can't bring in legislation. We can stop it, but we can't bring it in. It's incredibly undemocratic, but it's a stage. And I think we did it as best we could. We became some of the most identified MEPs. We could have probably stood in other countries. Pity we bloody didn't in some ways. MEPs in, Malta and in Germany and in Sweden and other countries saying, oh, you're very popular in my country. We're going, well, should have stood there then, but our language skills are absolutely terrible, so that wasn't really an option. But let's see. So yeah, I think it's a platform. It's an important platform, and it gives you an insider's view of the beast, and that's what we tried to expose. And I think we did that pretty well.
You collaborated, you collaborated with Yanis Varoufakis as well, with DiEM25.
Yeah, around the election, and in fairness, with people everywhere.
Yeah.
Like there were left groups in every.
Exactly, you are independent. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. But there are more pan-European, I will call them, because that's what DiEM25 is, a pan-European party, like Volt. And in Cyprus, we do have representative of Volt, and they do present themselves as left. And I would like to touch a little bit upon that, because how can you, I will put it as a question. Can you be left and believe that we need NATO?
Absolutely not. Completely incorrect. And my knowledge of Volt, I suppose, is limited. They had, I think, one member of parliament last time, total Europhiles. I mean, to us, these people were absolutely horrific. I mean, there is a breed of person at the moment. They're actually being bred. It's a project of people who go to European schools, who are kind of being born for the bubble, who don't seem to have, I mean, I'm an internationalist. I want good European relations. I want good relations beyond Europe. But I'm an Irish European, and people should be Cypriot Europeans or German Europeans. We all come from our different backgrounds, and those backgrounds should be encouraged and put our stamp on it, because that's how you're rooted to the people you represent. To me, Volt are just a creation of Europhile, European Union flag-waving bureaucrats, really, who have a sort of a soft liberal ideology, but are completely exposed. The biggest test facing humankind is always how you react to war. And I think that's been the biggest expose of the Greens, for example, and the German Greens. You can't be a Green. Volt would say they have a brilliant environmental record on legislative files, and they do. But you can't be a Green if you support militarization. It's an absolute nonsense. You can't be a left-wing person if you think that the resources of society should be spent on weapons of war to kill people and make profits for big companies, rather than to attend to the needs facing society. So to me, they're a total sham. I mean, they have big money backing. There are vested interests who support them. It's part of a desperate effort to create a European identity, which is not a real identity for the real people of Europe, because they all come from their own backgrounds and they want to stand together but separately. This is trying to create a separate European identity above the identity of the member states, and that's inherently undemocratic as far as I'm concerned. But I haven't been impressed by them at all, but they have big money backing and resources for sure.
Mm-hmm. You would say that Zionism, imperialism, colonialism are basically the same thing on the same level. There are so many things going on at this moment everywhere, whether it's Palestine, Lebanon, Yemen, Ukraine, everywhere. Do you think that this is the last rattling of the empire?
Because I actually do. I mean, I think what's happening in Gaza is not accidental. It's a warning. It's a harbinger, really, because what's going on there, it's not that this is the first genocide, but it is the first genocide that has been openly declared and fully carried out in the public view, and the world has been unable to stop it. It has been done deliberately. The rules of international law, which were put together after World War II, we know, of course, that, they were never really for us. never really for the West. They were really for our enemies, you know, but they did keep certain order on things. Now those rules of international law are being publicly bonfired, and the rules of a new, much more unfair and violent world order are being painted before us. And in some ways, they're not new. They're the old values of colonialism, which never really left, but which were dressed up a little bit and put in check a little bit out of the horrors of World War II. Now they're being returned to. The old rules of might is right, colonialism, occupation, brutality. All of this is a free for all, and it's being driven by the military industrial complex. And I mean, I think Israel is in the vanguard of that. It was, after all, and is a European settler colonial project. It's an apartheid state. As Biden said years ago, if it didn't exist, we'd have to create it to bring instability in that region, to allow corporate power from the West to exploit those areas, and indeed Africa and others, for their own benefit. I mean, the sickening irony of the hypocrisy of the European Union, who say that, oh, but when we go to these places, we don't have interests, we have values. They're in there exploiting these countries for their own resources, of private energy companies of France or Germany or whatever, to make profit. And then out of that instability, when desperate people try to flee the effects of war or the climate change that we've inflicted, the same big companies benefit from the big contracts to keep them out of Europe's borders. So yes, I do think this is the sort of dying days of US empire, who are desperate now, under threat from China, not militarily, but economically. The US economy is not the way it was. I mean, in the next weeks, we'll have the BRICS summit in Kazan in Russia. This represents over 50% of the world's population, 40% of production. There's a new power rising. The days of US dominance are at an end, but as we always say, the last bite of a dying snake is the most dangerous, and we live in incredibly dangerous times where the lunatics have taken over the helm of the running of Western society, where decisions are being made that are blatantly against the wishes of the citizens, and yet they continue to repeat all the time and to be a vassal state of the US against Europe's interests. It's crazy. The only positive on that is that out of the horror, and it's dreadful that it's taken the horror of Gaza for many people to wake up to this, but loads of people in Europe have had an awakening. They now see the European Union differently. I mean, a lot of people in Ireland actually believed all the nonsense that the European Union was about values and democracy and rule of law and all this nice stuff. Now they see, well, how could that be when you've not only, done nothing about a genocide, but you've actually enabled to continue to arm the genocidal side. So, yeah, I think you're right. I think these are really seismic events. They're a turning point in world history.
You mentioned immigrants and immigration. I mean, yeah, Africa, we say that Africa is poor. Africa is not poor. Just give them back their own resources that the Europeans are exploiting. But you were also criticized about your stance on immigration, weren't you? No?
Not really. I mean, we've been very clear. I mean, we've been very open that, Europe's position on migration has been absolutely appalling. I mean, the Dublin Agreement originally, in saying that people have to be located in the first place where they land, has caused huge problems for member states on the southern borders of Europe.
Cyprus is the first, because we've got Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, right across. I mean, yeah.
Well, then you have these sort of bleeding heart liberals in maybe, France or whatever, saying, oh, Cyprus and Italy, these are racist and you're terrible. But then they don't step in and say, come on in, we'll take a big load of people here. So this idea of European solidarity is very low. But look, in the overall scale of things, the numbers seeking or who manage to get to Europe's borders are really very small in comparison to our population. We are in desperate need of a workforce in whole parts of Europe, and really migration is just used in the same way as it always was, to divide and rule, to have a convenient scapegoat to blame the problems of Europe on, when in actual fact the problems are those at the helm who control the economic resources and who are the ones who destabilized those countries in the first place. So it's the old tactic of divide and rule. There is, unfortunately, there has been a huge move to, I suppose, radicalize people around migration. And because people are so lost in the way in which society has been organized now, there would be a growth of racist ideas and far right ideas, even in Ireland, where it never really existed before. So in that sense, we've had more debate about it. But to be honest with you, it was it was obvious to me during the European elections and the local elections here in Ireland, migration was the only thing being talked about. And we don't actually have a migration problem. They don't handle it well.
Same in Cyprus, it was number one issue.
Yeah.
Well, we do have a problem, so yeah. But it was number one issue.
The media, every single day, migration. Oh, we've all these people. The minute the election was over, that was gone. And the only reason why the Irish system is slightly dislocated is because the Irish government, to curry favour with the European masters, went out of their way to almost entice Ukrainian refugees in. So we've had a massive influx. Over 110,000 Ukrainians have been brought into Ireland. They've been given preferential treatment. I mean, our government, which really annoyed people, actually our government implemented a racist migration policy because they gave Ukrainian migrants more benefits than they gave to other migrants, and even than they gave to Irish people. So we had them saying, again, against the backdrop of a housing crisis, saying, we're going to build houses for Ukrainians. And then working class Irish people said, sorry, my family are living in my home with my grandchildren and my daughter who can't get a house, and they've been there for years, and you're going to build houses for Ukrainians. Why aren't you building them for me? And then if anybody said that, they'd say, oh, you're a racist. Well, that's not being racist. That's somebody saying, why are you managing the resources of society like that? Why didn't they say we'll build houses for all, including Ukrainians? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So
you're creating racism in a sense. Exactly. I know you're in Ireland.
Yeah,
I know you're in Ireland, but I would like your thoughts on the clashes and the riots that happened in England. Just to give you a short note on this, Mr. Robinson was in Ayia Napa in Cyprus holidaying when that was happening and giving instructions whilst on holiday in one of the beach resorts in Cyprus. So I'd just like your thoughts on that, on what happened there.
Yeah, I mean, there has always been a dangerous far-right, fascist, organised minority in Britain. It never really happened in the north, although they would have had in the north of Ireland, but they would have had some links with loyalist forces in the north of Ireland. And we've even seen some of that violence around what happened in Britain there in Northern Ireland itself, with even some people from the south of Ireland participating in that. So I actually think some of it is being deliberately manipulated by the state. I would be very surprised if British state forces aren't in some ways involved in some of that. But it comes from desperation by some people, but really an organised fascist criminal element stoking up a legitimate discontent that's there. But there are definitely very sinister forces at work. I mean, in Ireland now, we have these people organising, including Robinson, and they now go and they sloganeer with their flags and that about Ireland for the Irish. Now, these are the people who it was Ireland for the English up until very recently, and all of their entire history. These are, you know, British imperialists really in their history, but now they want Ireland for the Irish, migrants out. I mean, it's absolute rubbish when most, you know, Irish diasporas all over the world, like Ireland has always emigrated. The idea that we would say we'd have a problem with, you know, tens of thousands of people fleeing war or climate change in other places. I mean, the government has mishandled migration, absolutely, and there are hugely legitimate questions. But the problem is, and I think this is something in all societies, the way in which political dialogue has been held now. You can't have an exchange of views. If you express a different opinion, you're immediately racist. So if somebody questions the government's mishandling of migration, which is perfectly legitimate, you could be labeled a racist. So a lot of people say, oh, I don't want to get into that. I don't want that. Or if you object to it, you're called far right. A lot of the people aren't. They just see the double standards that are there and they don't like it. And the left hasn't been active enough in the communities around the real issues that are the problem. Because if you look at the numbers of migrants and newcomers into Ireland, I mean, when the European Union enlarged, we took in well over 100,000 Poles and Latvians, and then there were a spike in ordinary asylum cases at that time. The figures aren't dissimilar to what they are now, but the difference now is that when that happened, those people had houses to live in and they were all allowed to work. Now there's a massive housing crisis in Ireland and it's growing throughout Europe, and they're not allowed to work. So that's been the nugget. So rather than the left concentrating on that we need housing for all and why are we upping our military expenditure, why are we wasting money on stuff like that, why aren't we building houses for people, why aren't we allowing people to work so we can get those houses built and all the rest, they're not doing that. They're labelling some of the people who are opposing that as far right. And that sadly just drives those people into the hands of the far right because they're so demoralized and they say, well, if that's what I am, yeah, okay, yeah, I'm far right. You know, they're not really. Now, that doesn't say that there isn't a criminal and organized element manipulating that. There absolutely is. And that needs to be stamped out. But unfortunately, it's growing with the help of the mainstream media and the lack of effective organized work on the ground by the unions and by the left in general.
I'd like to touch on two things before I let you go. One is the elections in Venezuela and the interference, basically, of the US government in the elections. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I've been to Venezuela many times when I was in the Irish Parliament and indeed when we were in the European Parliament. I'd been invited to observe these ones and we couldn't go. I was very sorry afterwards, given what happened, that we hadn't been there to bear testimony, but I am hoping to go in again at the start of October. They have organised some Palestine solidarity events around the anniversary of the genocide. So a couple of MEPs who were in the parliament with us, some Spanish communists and ourselves, are hoping to head to Venezuela again. Look, this is the history of Venezuela all over. US interference has dominated their politics now since Chavez took power. We know the attempted coups in the past. This is, again, more of the same. I mean, when we were there over the years, we've seen the devastating impact of the sanctions there. I mean, there's no doubt about it. People in Venezuela are really suffering dire consequences because of the stranglehold of sanctions. I would think the government has made mistakes, plenty of mistakes for that matter. But I do think that they have the backing of just about a majority of the people, and certainly the poor people. I mean, when you're in Venezuela, you can go to places where the wealth is just astounding, where you see people who are quite white, but they are, you know, they're the old colonialists who settled there, and they have a vested interest in ensuring that Venezuela goes back to the way it was, where the wealthy elites run it. The idea of the usurpers, the people that Chavez and Maduro represented taking power, has always been abhorrent to them. So they will continue that. I mean, I found it unfortunate that the likes of Lula and that have come out and been, you know, saying, oh, maybe you should have new elections. I would say they probably, you know, I'd say the results were broadly accurate. And I think we've definitely seen very clear signs of external interference. That's always there in Latin America. It's there now on our borders in Eastern Europe now. US empire operates and funds and enables an opposition. That doesn't mean that there aren't legitimate concerns by many people who might look to the opposition. I'm sure there are. As I say, I think the Venezuelans have made mistakes, but I think as somebody of the left, our first job and our first defense has to be to stand against foreign interference and against empire, and then to work in a fraternal way with the Venezuelans to assist them deal with the problems facing their people, which are many. But it's deeply concerning. I mean, we know the attempts from before with Guaido, all of that nonsense, trying to nominate him. So when they talk now about the illegitimacy of the election. Let's remember back, these were the people who, sort of supported an unelected moron in Guaido who robbed so much money out of that country, who tried to organize a coup and all the rest. So this is history repeating itself. But it is dangerous because the economy is in dodgy ground. And when you think about it, all the Europeans getting up on their high horse, not recognizing Maduro, but then Macron won't recognize the results of the French election, and no one has a problem with that, European hypocrisy alive and well, always.
It's the double standards. And the hypocrisy, and the United States elections, they're coming up in November, and the way it's being presented, that there are two parties, basically, that's it, and you have to choose the lesser evil. In this case, most people are arguing that the lesser evil is Kamala Harris. Would you agree with that? And how do you get out of this? I mean, how would you get out of having to vote for one or the other?
Yeah.
When they're both following the same policies, they've just got a different way of saying things. That's my opinion.
Oh, it's the biggest con going. And let's remember that this is the country which has 800 bases around the world that say that they are defenders of democracy and the free world. Well, if that's democracy, is it any wonder that so many people around the world have rejected it? That's not democracy. People cannot get on the ballot paper. You know that whole sections of society are banned from voting because they can't vote. Maybe they would have a prison sentence. We know that many Black people are more likely to be in prison than white because of the systemic racism, and on and on and on. And they represent the same thing. I don't think there's any lesser evil. If I was there, I would support, the light. I mean, you'd have to kind of support the Green Party are not too bad. They're generally terrible in Europe, don't get me wrong, but Jill Stein.
Yeah, Jill Stein.
Jill Stein's is an exception, not the Green Party. I'd support Jill Stein's or, the independent guy whose name escapes me. But it's tokenistic. They're not going to get elected. But how do you break out of that? Well, the only way in which you can break out of it is by ordinary people going back to their history because there's a huge left-wing history in America. And in some ways, I suppose I do take great heart out of the radicalization of huge swathes of American youth around the issue of Gaza and Palestine. I mean, the movements in America or US have been absolutely unprecedented in terms of their support of Palestine. And it's very significant that large numbers of US Jewish community, particularly young people, have broken with Zionism and that. And that's a huge part of a break because big money interests control US politics. And our concern is that European politics are going exactly the same way. So they're removed from the people. The only way you can grab that back is by ordinary people organizing for themselves. And I think we've seen that. I mean, the movement around the campuses was very reminiscent of Vietnam. And the changes that followed from Vietnam after the students organized first, other people came on board. I think we're at that stage in the US, but it's incredibly difficult. I mean, I had a short break in the US there in the summer, and you just see the conditions that people live in. I mean, you've old people in their 80s with shaking hands working in shops, and not by choice, it's out of poverty. And yet they're spending massive amounts of money on militarization. People are getting no representation from either the Democrats or the Republicans. In some ways, the Democrats have been worse in terms of war on the world scale. Obviously, I think Trump is deranged, clearly, but Kamala Harris is just a puppet of the big business in the same way. They're exactly the same. Exactly the same. There is no lesser evil as far as I'm concerned, and there's no shortcut. The people of America have to organize to break that system in an organized mass way. It's not easy, but maybe the developments on the world scale with the reduction of US influence, the growth of the BRICS countries and so on might put some manners or might wake up some people. Who knows? But definitely lunacy all around.
We're going back to social media. I don't know if you saw it. There was a video going around from TikTok, I believe. U.S. soldiers were watching the Kamala Harris, Donald Trump debate, and Kamala Harris came out and said, as of their Biden administration, there is not one single U.S. soldier in combat at this moment anywhere in the world. And the camera was on the television, and then the soldier turns around, shows everybody in the barracks and says, "What the hell are we doing here then?" Because they are. But the narrative that they want, I mean, the Democrats, to put out that they don't. They are peace lovers and democracy lovers, but however, we will support Israel to defend itself, which is just.
They are. I mean, that's why they're nearly worse. I mean, Trump appears to be a vile human being, but he is what you see.
What you get, you see. What you get is what you see.
That's less dangerous from what I can see, because people know what they're getting. The Democrats play a game, and Harris has played a game. I mean, it's disgusting. She has stood behind Biden throughout this administration, as the US have enabled that genocide. It would never have started without the Democrats, without the US government, and it certainly would have been well over. One phone call was all it took. Quite deliberate. She was full part of that. And now she gets up and puts nice language around. People will see through that, of that, I'm sure. Nobody in the US is buying that. The rhetoric has been dampened down, but it's duplicitous. It's a lie. It's like what Obama did, the exact same thing. He was good looking, he was articulate, he was everything that Trump isn't. But he, killed out more attacks on people with drones and extrajudicial executions on people in the Middle East and wars and all the rest of it. So I think it's just, they have their pet projects. One will be worse on Iran, one will be better on Ukraine, but all of them are in hock to the military-industrial complex, because you can't be president of the US unless you're financed to the tune of billions, and very few people have those resources themselves. So the paymaster comes looking afterwards, and if it's big pharma, big tech, big business, whoever it is, they want payback, and they'll get it. Whichever one of those puppets are there, and the only way to stop that is the organized power of the people of the US, who are great people, or who don't want their taxes wasted on war. But the indoctrination of militarization in US society is quite shocking, and their lack of knowledge of what goes on around the world is quite shocking. I mean, when I was in the US, all the shops would have discount for veterans, and it wouldn't be unusual. Now, I was in the south of America, which is more conservative, but they'd say, "Thank you for your service," if somebody came in and tried to get a discount. If you went to a show, there might be, "Have we any veterans or some members of our military here in the audience? Please stand up, ladies and gentlemen." Offer here. That's an Irish person from a neutral country. I'd never seen anything like that. How much militarization is part of the political, way of life in the US, and how they think that they are helping around the world, when actually it's the destabilization influence of empire that is the biggest destabilizer globally. Mad stuff. But only the US people can see through that. And I don't want to be negative, because I'm not, because I think what we're seeing, these are very dark days, but there's always hope. And the hope is in the awakening of young people in the US and globally, who are understanding now the way in which their society is being organized. And I think particularly in the global south, we have a generation of new leaders in the former colonized countries, which are still the victim of Western influence, but they are not going to return to the old days where they're just going to be the slaves of the West. Burrell can talk about Europe being a garden and the rest of the world being a jungle. Well, it might be a jungle because Europe and the West made it so, but those people now are educated and they're demanding their fair share. That's not going to change. It definitely isn't. There is a new world order growing, but all the time when there's new life and something new giving birth is always painful. And I think we're in the painful stage at the moment. But
you mentioned that Europe is waking up. sadly, I will note that Cyprus is always last to follow. We get hit, I think, by everything last. Because being such a small country as well, and being in the position that we're in, I mean, we have US military people calling Cyprus a permanent aircraft carrier in the Middle East, which is what it has turned into, a permanent aircraft carrier. A NATO hub, people are calling it now a NATO hub. Declassified UK, Matt Kennett has done a lot of research, and it is out on social media. Not one media channel in Cyprus has picked up on it, saying and proving, because now you can track everything. I mean, I can go on Flight Tracker and I'll tell you which military C-13 is going off to Gaza from Akrotiri. We've got two bases, Akrotiri and Dikalia. However, at the same time, our complicity in the Amalthea project, where we had Ursula von der Leyen come on the 8th of May, Women's Day as well, to inaugurate the Amalthea aid going from Cyprus to Gaza, which was a sham, which basically we helped the Zionists and the Americans massacre 121 people, coming just to save, I think it was 4 hostages they saved. And then they dismantled the pier that was used to supposedly take in aid. However, our government is using that as an excuse, and as they're saying basically that we are not giving anything but humanitarian aid, and that cannot be when I personally have seen US Air Force planes on the tarmac at Larnaca Airport when I was going on holiday this year. So basically, they're also using our airports as well. If you had any advice to give, or I wouldn't say advice, but a piece of what you think, a nudge in the right direction that you would give to the Cypriot people. I'm not talking about the government, because I don't think they would take any advice. What would it be? I mean, we're watching all this happen. I can hear, I'll send you videos. You can hear the planes going off, setting off from Akrotiri. Last week, there were ospreys flying around my house. There was a phantom flying over my house in the middle of the night. And I put it on social media, and a friend of mine in Lebanon texted me back and said, Melanie, this is 24/7 in Lebanon for the past 40 years. And I couldn't get over the feeling of feeling these beasts flying so close to the house. And I kept on thinking, what do the people in Gaza feel when they feel them, they see them, but then they are also hit by them? So what would your advice be to the Cypriot people? What can we do to motivate, to stand up to what is going on?
Well, I mean, you've painted a devastating picture, but it's not as unique as you might think. I think it's unique in the sense of where you are geographically located, that you really are on the front line, and you have, painted how real that picture is. But actually, the processes are the same everywhere, because we're supposed to be a neutral country. We're supposed to not be in NATO, and our government will tell you, of course, we've nothing to do with NATO. Absolutely not. We don't want to be involved in NATO. And yet they're being sucked into European defence integration at a rate we've never been seen. Like, we have a civilian airport in Shannon, which has always been allowed to be used by the US military going to the Middle East. That is being used now by the US going to Israel, going to Gaza. We know that that's the case. We know that the Irish government, even where support for Palestine is about 95%, and all of their rhetoric is supportive, but the sale of dual-use goods going to Israel since the genocide started has absolutely skyrocketed from Ireland. Same processes. I was at a peace event in Norway, another supposedly neutral country, but obviously involved with NATO, and now for the first time considering US bases, where you'd activists there. And I was at another one in Sweden where they'll say, oh, Sweden has joined NATO, now Sweden is on side. No, they're not. people in Sweden, people in Norway, people in Ireland are all, albeit in small numbers, beginning to realize exactly the process that you've outlined in terms of Cyprus. So it's more developed in your case because of where you are, but the exact same processes are going on elsewhere. So I think the advice really, and what we try and do in Ireland and around all of the Palestine solidarity events, is their whole process of political education. I mean, while there are many people in Ireland who never heard or understood what was going on in Palestine in terms of the Nakba or any of that until October the 7th, either young people or even some older people who maybe believe some of the propaganda that it was kind of like just a two-sided thing. Those people have been awakened now out of the horror, and out of that they're beginning to learn. So I think political education, knowledge, putting the information out there. I know it's difficult. A lot of people are in a bad place in their lives. They're trying to get on. The enormity of the problems that we face can sometimes swamp them. But we need to link up like we're doing now, like the events we were at in Norway, like the events in Sweden, for people to realize in all of our little countries, we were the neutral ones. I mean, Ireland is a tiny country as well. And when we joined the UN, we brought in and were instrumental in treaties being formed, which ended nuclear non-proliferation. Now they're doing everything they can to basically get into NATO. How the hell did that happen? Because our institutions have been captured, our media has been captured. But actually, even though a lot of people may not realize what's going on, I think we can open their eyes a bit more, because they certainly, I think they realize the system is broken now out of the horror of Gaza. Not everybody, but large numbers of people. And the only way to fix something is first realize that it's broken. And I think we are getting to that stage. So I think we have to educate, agitate, and organize. No new formula. The old ways are always the best. We have an opportunity now with social media. We have an opportunity now. It's easier to travel and connect online. But I do think there's a responsibility for all of us across Europe to begin to develop that and to realize all the things we have in common and reclaim the institutions of power from the people who basically robbed it in the interests of big business. So yeah, educate, agitate, organize, as always.
Thank you so much for helping me end on a positive note. And hopefully things will get better sooner rather than later, because the loss of life is immense and the suffering is also immense. Thank you, and I wish you the best of luck.
Thanks so
in
much,
whatever
Melanie.
you do.
You too.
I'll see you on the streets. I know I'll see you on the streets.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thanks a million.
Thank you.